He's one of the heroes, right?
Hey, we have the recording. Yes, okay, recording. Fantastic, great. Well, we are very excited to welcome Professor David Stringer today. And he has come from the University of Indiana in Bloomington. He's originally from the UK, around Newcastle, yes. And he did his undergraduate work at Manchester and then his PhD at Durham, along with a whole bunch of linguists that, that we know, we're mutually acquainted. And his background is in linguistics. And then after moving to Indiana, and you've also lived in Japan and Portugal and Italy, and you've taught in those countries, is that right?
Spain. Yeah.
And Spain, sorry, and Spain as well. And then eventually, David veered away from formal syntactic models of language acquisition and into biocultural diversity and the role of, and the interplay between languages and the natural world and ecosystems, and that is where he's going to lead us today. He's got another talk tomorrow morning, if you can make both talks, and we're very happy to welcome him here today to talk about ethnobiological calendars as tools in Indigenous language revitalization. So I'll close the door as well.
Well, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. Yeah, so I haven't entirely left behind generative linguistics. I still do it as part of my job. But my passion, actually, in the last 10 years or so, has shifted away from that area. I think a lot of divisions in linguistics, like divisions in other academic disciplines, turn into sort of socio-political things, and one group hates the other group, whereas in fact, very often, you're just asking different research questions, right? Very, very often that's what it comes down to. So I have a very sort of open, interdisciplinary approach to language and ecology. A lot of the work I would do now would be called linguistic anthropology, really, rather than linguistics proper. But let me talk a little bit about the relevant background coming into this project. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been looking at language revitalization and environmental linguistics. And specifically, I'm interested in how traditional ecological knowledge is encoded in language, whether it be encoded in vocabulary, in the mental lexicon, or encoded in syntax or morphology, or also from a much broader perspective of what linguistics is, in narratives, in songs, in prayers, in rituals that are passed on from one generation to the next. I'm interested in how language practices, very broadly defined, facilitate the intergenerational transmission of ecological knowledge. Just for those linguists in the audience, but it seems that I don't have many skeptics here. Usually I've got a bunch of people say like, what are you doing? It doesn't look like biology, it doesn't look like linguistics, what are you doing? So if there are any linguists in the audience who don't usually look at this stuff, this gives you an idea of how complex and how interesting this can be. So lots of languages have classifiers. So when I went to live in Japan, I thought, okay, I'm going to teach myself Japanese. How do you count to 10? And then realized that there are lots of different ways of counting to 10, because whether you're counting flat two-dimensional objects or cylindrical objects or small furry animals or little birds, there's different numbers, right? So lots of languages have classifiers. Some of them are numerical classifiers, like in Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. Some of them are possessive classifiers, like in Hawaiian, like my piece of paper or my grapefruit or my daughter. There's 3 different words for my. It depends what you're counting. Some languages just have classifiers for all nouns. You just can't say a noun without first classifying it. And Piaro is one of those languages spoken in the Amazon, mostly in Venezuela, where you cannot say any noun without first classifying what it is you're talking about. They have about 120 different classifiers, but fully 75 of them are ecological or biological, right? Telling you not only if something's edible or poisonous, but whether the kind of thing you're talking about, generally speaking, is a thin, free-flowing sap. One of 100 words for that sort of thing. or whether it's a rosette-shaped herbaceous plant, or whether it's a kind of hanging branch-stemmed fruit bunch. So for those of you who are interested in the nuts and bolts of linguistics, this stuff can be more interesting than you might think. My linguistic anthropological assumptions are largely in line with Tim Ingold, in that I don't think anthropology should be confined to ethnographies. We live in a world where there are many indigenous scholars who can write their own ethnographies, and they don't need people from Western universities to come and write them for them. But I do believe there is value in a comparative anthropology. I think there are lessons that you can learn from one particular situation in the world that will help tremendously people in a similar situation in another part of the world, especially as many indigenous cultures are facing the same global international threats. I also am on board with what Ingold says about the nature-culture dichotomy. I think for our definitions of nature and culture are often very specific to the cultures we happen to grow up in. So society doesn't stop at the human for many different cultures, and you can have relations in other species and across different taxa. And I believe that humans and non-humans are intertwined in the same dynamic web of life. So here's just some starting assumptions. Just to give you an idea of the kind of work I do, because for many people it's just confusing. What do you mean language and ecology? Some recent papers involve, today's talk is a chapter that I'm writing right now for inclusion in a book on ecological calendars, which is going to be called probably Salmonberry Birds and Flower Petal Stars. I've also done work on an edited volume that Radhika here is a co-editor of, on taking work on language acquisition and language attrition and relating it to the passing on of traditional ecological knowledge. Because if you stop speaking your mother tongue completely by the age of 6 or 7, you'll lose everything. You will lose everything in that language. It will be essentially erased from the brain. This happens to people who are adopted. This happens to people who are children of missionaries. And it happened to my own daughter, whose primary language was Japanese, because we used to live in Japan. But she lost the ability to speak in 3 months and the ability to understand in 6 months. It's only after about 8 to 10 that languages crystallize, and you kind of have them for life. So they come flooding back, even if they get rusty. This is just to give you an idea of some of the things I've been working on. Also, environmental personhood is something that I'm very interested in. Then I also share an interest in animacy in languages, and I've written a paper which is coming out this year, I hope, on how linguistic argumentation can be used in legal cases, arguing for environmental personhood in sort of a topic that I'm sure many of you have heard of. I co-edited, I try to be, as much as I can, to acknowledge the fact that when people get interested in decolonization of the academy, that there's an awful lot of internal decolonization that you have to do. We all come with a lot of baggage in our heads, whether we realize it or not. So I've made an effort also over the last few years to try not only to write articles for international peer-reviewed journals and Western European or American publishers, but I've tried to sort of build up relationships with scholars in the global South, because there's a lot of great research that just doesn't get published because it doesn't pass the muster of the L2 English standards or whatever. So this book just came out last week. And I'm also, for me, this is not just academics. For me, this is about raising consciousness about endangered languages and endangered ecosystems, and also, to say it more positively, the potential for language reclamation and ecosystem regeneration, because some of the most successful projects in those two areas around the world have been projects that unite those two things. Mm-hmm. So the general framework I find myself in most of the time is biocultural diversity conservation. So I work together with Louisa Maffei and other people in that area, and for me, sort of raising consciousness is a big part of what I do. So when I first started teaching my class at IU called Language Hotspots and Biodiversity, I decided not to make it a graduate class, but to make it or a postgraduate class, but to make it a class for freshmen or freshers or first years, so people could really think, oh, maybe actually what I really want to do, well, something I might be interested in as an undergraduate student is geography or anthropology or biology in this regard, because as you may or may not know, American students don't pick a major before they go to university, they specialize later. So we've been doing outreach to schools. Every fall, I have 60 university students. I take them to 6 or 7 elementary schools. I estimate that over the last decade, we've probably visited with 3,900 students, that's my best guess, aged about 8 to 10 years old. And of course, this is important because the teachers also become more aware of endangered languages and cultures and ecosystems. And on that note, I'm really happy to be here because CELCE is a very special thing. There aren't many places in the world like this, and when they are, they're often fragile. A few years ago, I was at the University of Kent in Canterbury at a similar centre, but that's been closed down. We have one at my university called the Centre for the Analysis of Social and Ecological Landscapes. I'm the only linguist. But these places are great. So I'm so happy to see that this is being continued and hopefully going from strength to strength. So today I'm going to talk about something that I sort of, I'm making my own jokes like a dad and laughing at my own dad jokes. But I'm thinking of these creatures as time beings. Birds, flowers, plants that tell you when something else is going on in the same ecosystem. So many indigenous communities are urgently engaged in language reclamation projects, but many people are also in danger of losing very precious traditional ecological knowledge. And while some people's focus is on language documentation and on trying to write things down, which is also important, my own focus is not on language documentation, but on language revitalization, in trying to create and provide and share tools for indigenous communities so that they can prevent language death and language extinction and keep such knowledge alive. So my specialization in linguistics is language acquisition, and I'm interested especially in bilingual language acquisition and bilingual education. And today I'm going to talk about these new bilingual ecological calendars that are being put together cooperatively in Australia by indigenous communities, especially in the north of Australia, and CSIRO, which is their kind of national science organization, a governmental science organization. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about these is not just because they're intrinsically super interesting and really beautiful, but because I believe they're a template that can be adapted literally to any language and any ecosystem. That makes me quite excited. Of course, the individual calendars are the property, the intellectual property of what in Australia are called traditional owners. But the template itself doesn't really belong to anybody and can be adapted quite freely. I am going to show you a couple of these calendars today, and in case I forget to mention it later, I do have permission from the local communities to show you these calendars. Okay, so one thing though that I'm going to say that may or may not surprise some people is that I am somewhat skeptical sometimes, and I'm wary is maybe a better word, of falling into an easy binary distinction between indigenous and non-indigenous people. This can be very controversial, especially in the United States, but for a start, there are many communities on the world who live in traditional ways that don't characterize themselves as indigenous, or other people wouldn't characterize as indigenous. A lot of these types, of these ways of knowing, don't belong to any particular community, but in fact are found everywhere in the world. So while my emphasis here is going to be on indigenous knowledge and indigenous communities, I'm also going to try to illustrate through using examples from England and Ireland how this kind of knowledge, these ways of knowledge actually were very well known here, not only before the Industrial Revolution, but well into my own lifetime. I'm not telling you much about when that started, but still. So highly localized ecological associations are encoded in folk names, and we all have folk names, sayings and songs across a broad range of cultures, in fact. So let's start out with some examples to show you what I'm talking about. And from now on, you'll be happy to hear I'm moving into pictures. So in Northern Australia, people know that when the bark peels easily from the gum tree, sharks in the river are fat and may be hunted. When the kapok tree blooms and the seed pods eject fluff into the air, it's time to gather crocodile eggs along the river banks. So this knowledge is not intuitive to outsiders, but it's also extremely important knowledge for cultural survival, especially when you think that in many parts of the world, as has been studied literally everywhere, many indigenous cultures have much greater nutritional value from traditional ways of farming, hunting, and fishing than from buying food at local commercial outposts, whether it be northern Canada or the Australian outback, where the food is often full of additives and preservatives and not very healthy at all. And also, many of these communities, this is the nature is their primary source of medicine. People don't buy medicine from pharmacies or chemists. So this type of knowledge is invaluable for community health. So let's talk a little bit about linguistics, but only a little bit, I promise, for the non-linguists. When you ask what a word means, that's a very vague thing to ask. There's two sides of meaning that are relevant for me here, reference and sense. So the reference of a word is the thing, this can get complicated, but for current purposes, this simple definition will do. The reference of a word is the thing it points to in the world, right? So if I say that is a rose or something, I'm pointing to this type of flower which is out there in the world, and you equate the meaning with the referent. So in other words, the word rose denotes that flower thing out there in the world. But the sense of a word is the meaning of a word relative to the linguistic system of which it's a part. And it's, again, this is one of those things that's best to illustrate by example. So, here, do I know of pictures of foxgloves? They might be in tomorrow's presentation. They might be here. Most of you, I guess, at least if you're from this part of the world, will be familiar with the flower foxglove, which has got nothing to do with foxes. It comes from foxglove, folk being the fairy folk. And of course it's a magical fairy flower because it can kill you or it can heal you. It's still used today for heart medicine. But if you go around England, you will find different dialectal terms for this flower. They're not always called foxglove or foxglove, they're also called fairy fingers, witch's glove, witch's thimble, fairy weed, dead men's bells, flapperdock, because kids can pop them up. And the idea is, if we were to only think that meaning was reference, then all these things would mean the same thing, because they all point to that flower out there in the world. But clearly, dead men's bells refers to the fact that it's toxic, whereas fairy fingers refers to the fact that it's a healing plant. So there is a difference between sense and reference. That means, and I know that we have some PhD students here who are working on glossaries. If you are an ethnobiologist or an ethnobotanist and you go out there in the field and you say, okay, in language A, here are the names of the plants, and in language B, here are the names of the plants, this name equals this name, I'm done. You're missing the point, because that's not what the name means. And what you have is in fact, in language, if you look across languages, extreme lexical relativity. One word never really means the same as another. Okay, so that's sense and reference. Another linguistic idea that I would like to introduce at the beginning of this talk is polysemy. Polysemy is when you have a word and it has more than one meaning, but those meanings are related. So it's not just homonyms. So for example, if I say, I smashed the bottle on the floor, you're thinking of the exterior glass of the bottle. But if I say that the baby just drank the bottle, you're thinking of the contents of the bottle, right? So this container-containee alternation is a typical example of polysemy. You know, you can climb through the window, if in the window being an open space, or you can smash the window and it's a pane of glass. There's lots of, if you say the bank transferred the money, you're not talking about the building, you're talking about the people who work in the bank. So polysemy is where you have predictable relationships between different meanings related to a single word. So now we can get started. That's all the linguistics you need. You don't need to know any more. The only trees from now on are trees with like branches and leaves. So in folk taxonomies, folk meaning like everyday names for things, a name can refer, for example, to both the plant that the disease, a plant that causes a disease, bad plant, or a plant that can heal a disease, good plant. So for example, in Kanakes, Binglu is a kind of tree, but it's also the name of the skin disease that the tree is believed to cause. And knapweed on the island of Guernsey, in Guernsey French, is known as herbe de flanc. And flanc is the name of the plant, but it's also the name of a cow disease of the udder that this plant cures. Polysemy can also be found in the names of calendar species. So look at this beautiful grasshopper. This is Allure, which means the child of the lightning. So the child of the lightning is the name of the grasshopper, but it's also the name of the bush that the grasshopper appears on precisely at this time of year. Look, there's an allure on the allure bush. But it's the child of the lightning because that's the spirit of the monsoon rains. Because when this grasshopper, clothed in the lightning, heralds the coming of the monsoon rains. When this grasshopper appears, you know that within 3 or 4 days the rains will come. So the name unites both the grasshopper, the coming monsoon, and the plant. And they also have other information that they know associated not through lexical semantics. You know that when the allure appears, you can gather wild red plums and green plums and black plums, wild red apples, sorry, at that particular time of year. On the northwestern coast of North America, lots of different languages, including Haida and Squamish, have a word for this particular bird, the Swainson's thrush, which literally means salmonberry bird. And when the salmonberry bird sings, it causes the salmonberries to ripen. There's a causal relationship in the minds of people who live in this part of the world, that it's the bird that's actually bringing the berries to ripen. And as the bird sings, you can hear the names of the colors of the different berries. Yellow ones ripen, orange ones ripen, red ones ripen. Further down the coast, in Baja California, in Mexico, in the Seri language, Janois means eelgrass. This is a kind of grain of a nutritional value similar to wheat or barley that grows in salt water under the sea. But how do you know when to harvest the eelgrass? Because the eelgrass bird tells you when to harvest it, right? So literally, it's this bird translates as the foreteller of eelgrass seed. The bird will dive into the ocean to feed off the eelgrass seed, and that's the sign that you should go there. And what month of the year is this? This is in April, which in Seri is called the moon of the eelgrass harvest. Right? So this is another example of polysemy, where it's connecting the bird and the plant, and also the time of year, the calendar month. On the topic of calendar month, you realize that even if you just look at North America, there's no such thing as one Native American culture or one Indian culture. Very different things happen in April for the Choctaw people who live in Mississippi, or the Ojibwe people who live up by the Great Lakes. So the name for April in these various languages could be, maple sugar moon in Ojibwe, thundering moon in Oneida, geese-laying eggs moon in Dakota, blackberry moon in Choctaw, duck hunting moon in Cherokee. Again, this is traditional ecological knowledge linguistically encoded in the calendar system. I could go on, but we'll run out of time. This is just to show that, I can go back to this later, that even in seemingly closely related cultures geographically, they don't really live in the same ecosystem. So if you look from space, oh, look at all these people living here. But you know, living by the coast is different from living in the valley, which is different from living in the mountains, which is different from living at this altitude. So actually different things are going on in different ecosystems, even for relatively closely related cultures in terms of proximity. So, you know, the tree frog chorus moon, or the black bear moon, or the wind month, you know, it's 3 examples of that in Saanich and Haida and Shuswap. Sometimes one key species can be the foundation of the entire calendar. So in parts of the Xingu Basin in the Brazilian Amazon, for example, the arrival of certain turtles up the river at a certain time will determine what time of the year you're in. The entire year is basically predicated around turtles. But one of my favorite examples of this has been in the Kodi calendar from Sumba in Indonesia, which is mostly organized around the sea worms. And so if you've never heard of sea worms before, these are a swarming kind of creature that is extremely important in Pacific and Indonesian cultures. So they are worshipped as a sacred species in Tonga, in Samoa, in Vanuatu, and in parts of Indonesia. They're a very important food source that comes at the end of a time of hunger or famine, depending on where you are, because these are very different environments. But they're also worshipped. And as somebody who did not grow up in a sea worm worshipping culture, the closest thing I can find to this within my own frames of reference is the novel Dune, where you have sandworms and priests of the sandworms, and the sandworms are sacred. Here you have sea worm. The creator goddess is Mother Sea Worm. You have sea worm priests, and the entire ritual culture is built around sea worms. So you have the small sea worms month, the big sea worms month, the last of the sea worms month, etc., etc. It's not only built around sea worms, but mostly. And honestly, this is so fascinating, I feel like I could chat about it like for hours. The science of these sea worms is unbelievable. So they don't have eyes, but they do have visual systems, and they're extremely sensitive to chromaticity. They can tell if the moon is at a 10 degrees angle and it's waxing, or a 10 degrees angle and it's waning, which we can't do. They're sensitive to the interplay between moonlight and sunlight at dusk. And they swarm at very particular times of year and a very particular time of the month, and it's the job of the sea worm priest to predict when they're going to swarm. Some of them are bioluminescent, because there's a whole bunch of different species in the same. Here's some different species. They're edible, yummy. If this is a triggering slide, I can move it. But they're a very important source of food. Some of them are bioluminescent and communicate with each other through light. And when they come to swarm, it's actually to make baby sea worms, so it's like a giant erotic light show. I mean, the science of this stuff is quite amazing, but the importance here is to do with the linguistics of it. I know some of you here, I was talking to some PhD students earlier interested in language and gender and ecology. A lot of these species are considered what they call trans taxa. So they can be male or can be female depending on particular manifestations. And trans taxa doesn't only refer to gender in that sense, but Mother Sea Worm could be a goddess, but she could also be an ancestor. There's a specific ancestor that is embodied. She's also called Mother Sea Worm Father Fish when she takes on male characteristics. The high priests in Kodi and Sumba are biologically male, but they often dress as women at certain times of year and for certain festivals, because they're manifesting the feminine aspect of Mother Sea Worm. Another way in which language can reflect knowledge of local ecology is in the Selva Lacandona in Chiapas in the south of Mexico, where people don't really keep track of, not everybody, but the Lakono Maya people, the Hanik people, don't really keep track of birthdays. So people know what month they were born, but they don't know what day they were born. So if you say, what's your birthday? You'll hear an answer like, I was born at the foot of the mahogany tree. That's the way you say it.
Mm.
And what it means is I was born during the month when the mahogany was flowering. So that the year for marking human births is based entirely on the flowering of trees. But so far I've been talking about lexical semantics and lexical encoding, that is how ecological knowledge might be encoded, well, calendar knowledge specifically, might be encoded in lexical items, in vocabulary. But it's also important, I've come to realize, I think Diane and I have been on similar trajectories, that language is not only about the nuts and bolts. It's not only, language is not only a computational system. It is that, but it's more than that as well. And I've been looking at narratives, texts, text-level information, songs, prayers that are also passed down from one generation to the next and carry with them ecological information. So one of my favorite examples of this is Wayampi people in the northern Brazil, mostly Brazil, have about 14 annual festivals. Each one is tied to a particular species. It could be a fish in the river, it could be a bird, it could be a plant. And then at the festival, time of the festival, people dress up as that person, whether it be a fish or a bird or whatever. And then they dance and they sing songs. And the songs encode the behavior of the species. They tell you about what to expect and what it means and why you're celebrating it. So a lot of children don't learn about other species because they go hunting with their parents, or because they go fishing with their parents, or because when they're 2 years old and 3 years old and 4 years old and 5 years old, they grow up hearing songs, right, and singing songs, and this information is passed on in this way. So actually there's a lovely story about this. So the anthropologist who collected this information was a missionary for the Summer Institute of Linguistics, and he really didn't want to drink because he thought alcohol was really wrong. That's the Midwest for you. But the thing is, you can't really participate unless you join in. So he had to get drunk while making all these notes, and it was a constant battle between inebriation and sort of like academic accuracy. Like, I kind of felt sorry for him a bit and also didn't. But so when a breeze blows at the beginning of the dry season and the stars of the Pleiades appear in the early morning, the taru-taru drinks fermented maniac, which gets you drunk, and starts to sing. And then the bird will sing all through the season until it stops singing. Right? When the taru-taru stops singing, that's when the sweet potatoes begin to sprout, and you can harvest them, and the Pleiades appear in the evening sky. Right? So this is some of the song. So this is not a word, it's not lexical semantics, this is a song that ties together the behavior of this bird, the behavior of the Pleiades constellation, which you might know as the Seven Sisters, and also the sweet potatoes. By the way, did you have Subaru cars in the UK? Kind of Japanese car? Subaru?
Yeah.
If you know what the logo is of a Subaru, Subaru means Pleiades in Japanese. And it has stars in it, but it only has 6.
Oh dear.
Well, oh dear indeed, because we can't really see 7 anymore. So the thing is, the stars we see in the sky change over thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
And 2,000 years ago, you could clearly see 7 stars. So some cultures have 6, some cultures have 7. They're often 6 brothers or 6 sisters. As it happens. It's often six bunches, a bunch of people going off to do things in whatever myth it is. But the Pleiades are a really important constellation for harvesting and planting, like all around the world. And even when they're not useful for that, they're still useful. So in I'll get back to that later. I'll get back to that on the next slide. So a lot of people from literate societies might assume that if an indigenous culture does not have literacy and doesn't have 2-dimensional maps, then they might not have a very clear idea about their own landscape or their own marinescape or where they live. But in fact, what you'll find is that non-literate cultures often have extremely sophisticated 3D spaces in their heads of where they live. And actually, back to the Pleiades, so the Barasana people, the Tucano people, the Desana people who live in the Vaupés region of the Upper Amazon in Colombia live on and around the equator. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, you can see the Pleiades in the south. If you're in the southern hemisphere, you can see the Pleiades in the north. But if you're on the equator, they rise right overhead. So therefore, they're the center of the night sky. So in fact, there is a star in the belt of Orion, Al-Nilam, which is the center of the celestial universe for the Barasana and Desana peoples. And it's connected by like an invisible thread to a rock on Earth, the rock of Ni, which is the center of the land, of the terrestrial plane. Now, it just so happens that when you look at this more scientifically, you realize that, in terms of Western science, you realize that the rock of Ni lies exactly on the equator at the point where the Pira-Paraná river is flowing north to south and the equator is going east to west, and it's kind of the center of their world. And they have this gigantic this is not to scale. So the whole of the night sky can be seen as a gigantic hexagon, and each of the stars in the hexagon is linked to a particular place on Earth, like a sacred rock or a waterfall. At any point, they know exactly where they are. So on to stars, because I've been talking a little bit about the importance of plants and animals for ecological calendars, but stars are also used by cultures all around the world to know when you are in the year. So in ancient Egypt, there were 3 seasons: flood, growth, and harvest. Right? The whole year is basically built around the seasonal flooding of the Nile, the planting and growth of crops, and the harvesting of crops. But in modern Ethiopia, it works in a very similar way. The Omo River has seasonal flooding, and the flooding comes in pulses. So you have to be really careful when you plant. Because if you plant too early, then you'll have another flood pulse, and it will take all the seeds away. And literally, there could be people starving to death in your village. Right? This is a life and death type of knowledge. So again, getting back to the language here, knowing when to plant is linguistically encoded in the names for the stars used to predict when to plant. What pay attention to is when the stars, when in this particular arc, are on the horizon at dusk. Right? So first you'll have the grass star when the first Imai grass gets flattened. Then you'll have the rising river star. Then you'll have the full river star. And then finally, the glorious time when you can plant, it's called the flower petal star, or the acacia petal star, literally, Sholbi. Because, and this is a very beautiful image as well, the acacia trees drop their petals into the water, and the receding floods are filled with flower petals. And that's when you plant. And I don't know if you can see that small picture of people planting. And it's important to realize that indigenous astronomy can surpass conventional science. Without going into the details here, because I'm worried about time, Quechua-speaking, Aymara-speaking people in the Andes in Peru and Bolivia could predict El Nino years, 500 years ago. But Western scientists only really cracked it about a decade ago, because they observed the heliacal rising of the Pleiades, and if the trade winds have changed direction, the Pleiades will be shimmering, right? So again, life and death. The Inca, the Quechua word used by the Incas for storehouse means Pleiades, right? That's where you keep your grains in the Pleiades. So far, all of these examples are examples which I think are really important, because they're examples relevant to endangered cultures, right? In processes of language reclamation and ecosystem reclamation. And it's often life and death, actually, and at least poor health and good health for children as well in many parts of the world. But it's important to stress that this is not just I don't believe you can divide the whole world into settler colonials versus indigenous people. It's more complicated than that. And people who live in Europe can be close to the earth or not close to the earth. It depends who you are, where you live, who your community is, right? So it's important to talk about how these examples that I've just presented might sound to some people exotic, but they're not. Just a lot of Europeans have forgotten, that's all. So when Samuel de Champlain, the French explorer, landed in Massachusetts in 1605, Wampanoag people told him that the best time to plant corn was when the white oak leaf was the same size as the footprint of a red squirrel. So when people read this, sometimes they think, well, I wonder what he would have made of that. But the fact is, he would have perfectly understood this way of thinking, because that's the way French people thought at the time as well, with regard to their planting and harvesting. Exactly the same. So I did some digging in the archives, and some digging in old books about flora in England and Ireland specifically. I'll be moving on to Scotland when I can, because they have a lot of stuff too, but so far most of my examples come from England and Ireland. And these examples were recorded as late as the 1970s. So how can leaf size guide the planting of barley and beans in England? Well, just paraphrasing, in Warwickshire, when the elm leaf is as big as a mouse's ear, it's time to plant your barley. But if it gets as big as an ox's eye, then you better hurry up because you'll be too late. And when elm leaves are as big as a shilling, it's time to plant kidney beans, but if they're as big as a penny, it's too late. I spent the summers of my childhood in the Yorkshire Dales, or the Lake District. That's where we spent all of our summers growing up. Here's a picture of a family hike a few years ago. Bassenthwaite, you can see to the north, Derwent Water in Keswick, you can see to the south. These photographs are taken from the same place. And in the summer, the hillsides are filled with foxgloves, right? But you might ask yourself, what could foxgloves possibly tell fishermen? Well, on Guernsey, in Guernsey dialect, in Guernsey French, you say, quand tu veux penir le claquet, mettez l'aine dans ton bateau et t'en vas au macré, which means when you see the foxglove bloom, put your nets in your boat and set off for mackerel, because you know the mackerel shoals are coming through the English Channel. What might alder buds signify? Where if you live in Leeds, I have no idea. It depends where you are, right? But if you're in Herefordshire, when the bud of the awl is as big as a trout's eye, then that fish is in season in the River Wye. It tells you when the fish are running up the river. Now, if you're not looking at elm leaves, when could you sow barley? Does anybody know this? Any other signs for barley sowing? Well, it depends on which part of the country you're from. I'm from Northumberland originally. So when the slate tree is as wet as a shade, show your barley whether it be dry or wet. So slow is a word for blackthorn. If you know gin, there's a kind of gin called sloe gin that comes from this plant. And in Gloucestershire, when the white blossoms come out, it's time to sow your barley. Now, colonists left Europe to go to the United States, and they brought this same kind of calendar knowledge with them, and they also learned from indigenous peoples who they met on the eastern seaboard of the United States. So shadfish, the word shad comes from an Old English word. It's not Native American. So it comes from an old word for herring, but it's not a herring. But anyway, shadfish are all over the eastern seaboard. The Lenape people, who still live on the eastern seaboard, had a 6-week-long festival when this fish started running up the rivers. Not like on Friday, this weekend, let's have a Halloween weekend. No, it was like 6 weeks of celebrating the fish running up the rivers. So what did the colonists do? They give the name to the fish, and then they give the name to the local tree, which blooms when the fish run up the rivers. But this is a shad bush, otherwise known as a shadwood or a shadblow, also more commonly known as a serviceberry tree. So some of you might know the work of Robin Kimmerer. She just produced another book called Serviceberry. That's this tree. I planted one in my garden. It's called a serviceberry tree because that was when it flowers when the ground is soft enough to bury people who died over the winter.
Oh.
So you can hold your funerals when the service tree blooms. I prefer the name shadbush. But this knowledge, this kind of traditional knowledge, arguably changed the course of American history. The shad's sometimes called the fish that saved America because this is probably more information than you need and probably nothing that you care about. But during the Civil War, there was a period where George Washington and his troops were holed up in a place called Valley Forge, and it was a very harsh winter, and they were losing the war, and they didn't have enough food, and they were starving and suffering from malnutrition. But George Washington, when he was a boy, came from a very rich family, but his family were involved in the shad trade, and he barreled shad when he was little, and he knew that the shad were going to come swimming up the Schuylkill River. He knew that the shad were coming. So we have accounts at the time, of the horsemen of the cavalry riding into the river, thrashing the river, and they pulled out fish by the thousands and basically saved the Union Army at a crucial time. So moving forward, a lot of people, I do some of my work with linguists, I do some of my work with ethnobiologists and ethnobotanists. A lot of people in those fields are asking, what can we do about this loss of traditional knowledge? How can we ensure that these traditional calendars are not lost, that they're passed on to new generations, or that they're documented so other generations can use them? And a lot of the focus has been on documentation, but as I said at the beginning, that's not my main interest. My main interest is actually trying to keep the knowledge alive in communities that still use it now. So several papers by Kassam et al., Shimura et al., are very interesting, very good papers about how scientists can work together with traditional peoples to document this kind of knowledge. But my focus is really on bringing it into the school system.
Yeah.
So, and I'm sharing these calendars with you because also I've been given permission, as I said, and Julie Nandel, from a traditional owner from the Kumbalanja community in Northern Australia, says, we want to share our knowledge with the kids and help them learn at school. So here's an example of what they look like.
Oh.
And you can see January, February, March, April around the outside.
Yeah.
And then you can see are there 7, I think? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think 6 or 7 seasons, because in Northern Australia, different communities have different seasons. There might be 5 seasons here, 7 seasons here, 6 seasons here, depending on what you do and how you live and how you eat. But what's interesting is inside the seasons, this is not going to work, is it? Hold on. There's a way for me to do this. What I'm trying to do here is zoom. So if you go inside, you can see that within one season, so Kujwek is the monsoon season when heavy rains bring the floods and the winds, but you also have mini seasons inside the seasons. You have seasons inside seasons.
Yeah.
So you know that when the Mandari flowers, it's a sign that the fish are developing eggs and also that the flying foxes are getting fat. Right? And the fireflies start flashing at this time, and they tell you by their flashing that the fruits are ripe and ready to collect. Just to give you some examples. By the way, I'm not sort of giving this to you as a privileged information that I'm sharing. These calendars are available on the internet. But what they don't want is, they don't want people to post them on internet sites, on Instagram. They don't want people to send them around an email. If you give a public presentation, people prefer that you ask to have permission. But you can see these in all their glory on the internet by just typing, doing a Google search for Australian traditional calendars. You can find them. So anyway, I won't belabor this because it's been 50 minutes already. But this sort of knowledge is really, really interesting and crucial, and rather than take my word for it, I want to show you a couple of minutes, just 1 minute here, 2 minutes here, 3 minutes here, of some Australian children who are being taught bilingually in their schools, and they're going to talk to you in English because it's for an Australian kids program on TV. But to show you how this is not just abstract, this is real, meaningful intervention. So that, because the calendar is not something you only study in the classroom, it's a tool to allow the teachers to take the children outside of the classroom, right, and interact with more than human relatives in the landscape. So, actually, I already brought this up earlier. So, if I escape, this hopefully should work.
You've got to be aware of things around you, the seasons, the plant, which way the wind's blowing, animals, trees that flower at certain time, and people. Everyone matters. And without you being aware of all those things, you might not be as lucky in being able to go and catch whatever it is that you're going to be hunting that day.
One of them.
Okay, 3:35. Oh, sorry.
My favorite bush tucker is turtle, barramundi, turtle and mimeli, turtle and crab. My favorite bush tucker is turtle, barramundi and plum.
And then
Okay, and one more little one.
And my favorite weather is dry season because I like to hang out with friends, go fishing, go hunting, get goose, go swimming.
In the dry season time, we get python and we cook it up on the fire and it's yum. At the end of the dry season, I like to go fishing for turtles.
We like to go hunting, fishing, pigging.
I love the dry season. I like doing flips, fishing, playing sport. That's it.
What's bush tucker?
If you go out into the bush, it means to go out into the countryside or to go out into the what white Australians would call wilderness.
Yeah.
And tucker, it means food.
Okay.
Like when I was growing up in England, our school used to have a tuck shop.
Yeah.
And a tuck
Yeah,
shop
I know
where
tuck
you,
shop, yeah.
so tuck and tucker are related.
Yeah.
That's what Australians call food. It's slang word for food.
Which my dad used to call food.
Yeah, tuck.
Yeah,
Yeah.
tucker.
Yeah.
Looking forward to my tucker.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We talked about tuck.
Okay, it
Yeah.
was tucker with you.
Yeah.
I somehow lost my place in the slideshow. I don't know how that happened, but let me go back. See.
Yeah.
I'm finished, by the way, just in case you're panicking. So just to say that I think this kind of knowledge is a knowledge of how human beings can be closer to the land and live in more sustainable ways within our environment and within the constraints of our environment. And it's not just a sort of indigenous versus non-indigenous ways of thinking. And sometimes when I think about this, I'm inspired by poets who've written about these sorts of relationships. So if this was a linguistics presentation, I'd probably read it in French, but that would sound pretentious perhaps in this environment. So in English, the famous Senegalese poet Birago Diop writes, "Listen to things more often than beings, hear the voice of fire, hear the voice of water, listen in the wind to the sobbing bush, this is the ancestors breathing." And some beautiful lines written by the singer-songwriter from Portugal, Zeca Afonso. The only ones who remember the old paths are those who pine for the land, those who long for the land. So it's not really, again, just to reiterate, I think, again, going back to sort of Tim Ingold and his more comprehensive comparative view of what anthropology can be, as far as I'm concerned, this is to do with how human beings connect to the planet, much more than a sort of indigenous versus non-indigenous ways of thinking. So, but it is a matter of urgency, especially when this sort of knowledge bears on issues of sustenance. And I think these sorts of ecological calendars are amazing because they're a template that can be applied almost anywhere, like in your own garden. So I was really gratified at the annual conference of the Society of Ethnobiology when two people came up to me after the talk and said, I'm gonna take this back to this project I'm working with. One of them in Hawaii, one of them in Aotearoa, New Zealand, saying we're gonna try to map the seasons using this template and see what we come up with. Because if we're looking not just to document but also to revitalize, I think we need tools like this. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was so much to chew on, too. Does anyone have any questions? Can take some questions. Janet, you must have a million questions. Oh, yes. Good.
Thank you, David, for your presentation. It's very fascinating and inspired me in many ways. I'm Andy. I'm from school.